Hello. Hi. All right.
Good morning.
Morning. So, welcome to the meeting. This week we had a couple of meetings. We had our DevaWorm meeting, which was good as usual. We covered some papers in there. We covered one of the GSOC projects, sort of the finale for that. And on Wednesday we did the Cognition Futures meeting. So we continued with the cybernetics paper that we've been working our way through. So last week we did the body of the text. We did that in 2 meetings, and Jesse read it word for word. So that was a good feat. We had some comments, but we're looking for additional comments. And then this week what we did was we went through some of the references. And, it's always tempting to go through every reference and kind of read about it. But we did go through some of the more cybernetic oriented references and talk about those a little bit. So that's that's the Cognition Futures meeting for this week, where we talked about that. So we talked a little bit about W.R. Ashby. We talked about the Ashby box. We talked about some of the other contributions to, or sort of intellectual precursors to, machine learning from cybernetics, which was actually fascinating to kind of read a little bit about Ashby and just kind of be in that mindset, thinking about like how he described, like statistical phenomena and systems phenomena. And this is well before we had a language in machine learning for it. So it's really interesting stuff.
Hey.
Hi.
I won't be able to say that much until later, but my general updates are just a lot's going on in general this week. It's been a very full week, and been a bit time constrained. I've had to manage a lot of things this week, but it's nice to go through the paper there. There's a little bit of progress on some grants and other activity. There's also, if I don't know if I'll be around later for this, but I remember in the chat Sunday, Trevor mentioned something about basically something with AmeriCorps, which I would follow up on if they're here later on. Just curious about that. I've also been looking into a lot of things around invisible illnesses this week. And I'm curious about what can be done from like our vantage point on certain things. Like there's certain like open data sets and projects to help out our volunteer with. But I'm considering some other things too. But that's really all I can say for now. I may be able to say a bit more later. But, yeah.
Well, that sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, I saw that conversation in the Slack. It's like Trevor was talking about, like you had a project idea and he was talking about some aspects of that. Looks like Shubham has joined us. Welcome, Shubham.
Hey Bradley.
Hi, how are you?
Actually, I'm good. So actually, I will be working on a project as part of my university for my final year. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that project, we will be using electrophotonic imaging to detect brain functions. So that is the title for the project, but I don't really know what can be done, what application can be made out of it. So because you have been working on neuroscience and everything. So I thought I can ask you for some guidance.
Yeah. Well, I'd have to see what's what the project is, what the what's going on there.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'd be happy to give feedback, and Morgan, I think, might be able to do that as well.
Yeah. I'm not exactly familiar with electrophotonic. If you've got a reference or something, I could probably say more.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, in general, like just the research.
Yeah.
Yeah, research questions or what people are trying to do with it. All right. Did you have any other updates, Shubham? I know I owe you a couple things. I owe you a certificate, and I agreed to write a letter of recommendation, so that'll come pretty soon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. I can share some updates later. Up until now, we have done some work. What it does is we have this device where you can measure a person's energy levels from their fingers and utilize that data to find more about. But I don't really know what application can be made out of it. So I'll share more details with you probably next week on Saturday again.
Okay, that sounds good.
To discuss it. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So there are a couple things in the Slack that may be interesting. So we've been continuing to populate the computational psychiatry channel. This is, I don't know where we reviewed this last, probably in July or August. So there's been a lot of activity in here. Looks like Trevor and Morgan have done most of it. But, keeping up with it is always important. So I think, there are a lot of different things in here that we could review. I'll just kind of look through a couple of them and just bringing them to people's attention here. So, there's all sorts of AI types studies like this one, AI-based differential diagnosis of dementia etiologies on multimodal data. This is a study in Nature. I think Jess wanted to bump, I don't know if it was this paper, but it was another paper to discuss later. This is a Nature paper. Personalized brain circuit scores identify clinically distinct biotypes in depression and anxiety. That's, I think, the one that Jesse bumped. He said it's worth. Morgan said it's worth it. So that's.
Oh, is that the yeah, let me move. But is that the Leanne Williams?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, definitely worth it.
Yeah. So this is where we need to derive quantitative measures based on coherent neurobiological dysfunctions or biotypes to enable stratification of patients with depression and anxiety. Using task-free and task-evoked data from a standard fMRI protocol conducted across multiple studies in patients with depression and anxiety when treatment-free and after randomization of pharmacotherapy or behavioral therapy. From these patients, we derive personalized and interpretable scores of brain circuit dysfunction grounded in a theoretical taxonomy. There are 6 biotypes that they extracted from the data, and they show consistency with our theoretical taxonomy and were distinguished by symptoms, behavioral performance on general and emotional cognitive computerized tests, in response to pharmacotherapy as well as behavioral therapy. Our results provide a new theory-driven, clinically validated, and interpretable quantitative method to parse the biological heterogeneity of depression and anxiety. Thus, they represent a promising approach to advanced precision clinical care in psychiatry. They have a study where they have treatment-free people, they have randomized treatments, And then they developed these scores, brain circuit dysfunction, and developed these 6 biotypes. And so you have these profiles of different parts of the brain and how they behave, or how they are activated, I guess. And so they're able to derive this sort of theory-driven approach to looking at brain dysfunction. So this is kind of showing what they did. And these are the clustering of regional brain circuit scores, identifying 6 biotypes of depression and anxiety. So this is the first network here. This is the second network, the third network, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth. So they're all kind of networks that involve different areas of the brain. So these intrinsic circuits are the default network, the attention network, and the salience. And then the task-derived circuits are negative, positive, and cognitive. So this is kind of where they're getting their color coding from. So you can see in the second example here, this is all attentional. This one here is attentional, salience, and default. So A is all 3, B is just the attentional, C is the negative and positive, D is cognitive control, and F is within norms. So there's nothing, doesn't involve anything. So this is kind of an interesting kind of way that they do this. Okay, back to the channel. There's a paper on psilocybin. Psilocybin desynchronizes the human brain. So, I know that Amanda's interested in the effects of hallucinogenics on cognition. Morgan and her have been talking about that. So I guess that's a Slashdot article pointing to a New York Times article. Let's see. A number of seminar series. This paper, Schizophrenia Genomics, Genetic Complexity and Functional Insights. So this is where we have, looking at the genomics of schizophrenia. The abstract reads, determining the causes of schizophrenia has been a notoriously intractable problem, resistant to a multitude of investigative approaches over centuries. In recent decades, genomic studies have delivered hundreds of robust findings that implicate nearly 300 common genetic variants, via genome-wide association studies, and more than 20 rare variants, via whole exome sequencing and copy number variant studies. So you have these, these different types of genomic studies, association studies, whole exome sequencing, and then looking at copy number variation. As risk factors for schizophrenia. So they've actually found, a large number of genetic variants that are kind of associated with schizophrenia, but they want to look more deeply into this. In parallel, functional genomic and neurobiological studies have provided exceptionally detailed information about the cellular composition of the brain and its interconnections in neurotypical individuals. Increasingly also those with schizophrenia. So this is something where we're interested in characterizing these neurotypical and neurodivergent brains. Taken together, these results suggest unexpected complexity in the mechanisms that drive schizophrenia, pointing to the involvement of ensembles of genes, this idea of polygenicity, rather than single gene causation. So basically, we have, a lot of times people try to ascribe single genes to single traits. And of course, that's not the way our genome works, especially in a complex system like the brain. They actually, in this paper, champion the view of genetic ensembles or ensembles of genes. So multiple genes having relatively small effects on a phenotype. And so this is what they're talking about here. In this review, we describe what we now know about the genetics of schizophrenia and consider the neurobiological implications of this information. So this is, I don't know if I have access to this, but this is a nice overview, I think, of what people are doing in this area. Okay. So yeah, Trevor, he put this paper in from the bioRxiv. This is from a previous meeting. We also have a framework for mesencephalic dopamine systems based on predictive Hebbian learning, a neural substrate for prediction and reward. So those are two papers, I think maybe this was from a previous meeting on August 10th. So reference that meeting for that conversation. And then Morgan links to Ryan Smith's website at the Laureate Institute, which Dr. Smith's lab focuses on understanding the neurocomputational mechanisms underlying emotion-cognition interactions and how they relate to brain-body interactions. So, yeah, that's all something that Trevor expressed interest in, so that was back on August 10th. And then this is a conversation that Trevor and Morgan were having, and I think we had this in the meeting too, about looking at GWAS and some other things. I know that I talked to him about Mendelian randomization and maybe doing a short presentation on that sometime. So that's what this is referring to. Mendelian randomization is a technique that people, I don't remember who was the inventor. He'll have to inform us on this. This is GraphDB. This is a database for health data science. So there's all sorts of data here if you're interested. That's sort of like a GenBank or an NCBI for sort of epidemiological data, I guess. Let's see. This is a Mendelian randomization analysis on gut microbiota composition. So this is gut microbiota composition is causally linked to multiple sclerosis, and this is the Mendelian randomization analysis on this. This is something Morgan pointed out to Trevor so he could give some feedback. And yeah, Trevor said doesn't have enough of a grasp on MR methods to know how they might be applied to the microbiome. So this guy, George Davey Smith, was the self-professed inventor of Mendelian randomization. So yeah, I'd like to hear more about this approach. So this is a link to this new set of or the first of a new set of papers from the Levin lab. And this is where Mike Levin says, here's the first of a series of preprints that will be posted over the next few weeks. And this is called The Multiscale Wisdom of the Body. Collective Intelligence is a Tractable Interface for Next Generation Biomedicine. So, of course, we know The Wisdom of the Body is the name of Cannon's book on homeostasis, and it was published back in like 1930, so it was about 100 years ago. And he talked about, homeostasis in medicine and physiology, and kind of thinking about like how you have these physiological set points that are, kind of the basis for most of the time we talk about homeostasis. And so this is the multiscale wisdom of the body. So this is actually where, they're looking at collective intelligence at multiple scales. So that's something to check out if you're interested. This paper is on stress-sensitive neural circuits change the gut microbiome. So this is a paper on more gut microbiome stuff. So I don't know if we really have an interest in that, but that's where we seem to have a fair number of papers being published on some interesting topics these days. There's more videos from YouTube that might be of interest to people. This is multiscale neurodevelopment. This, I think, is a research group. Yeah, so this is a research group out of Germany where they're doing this type of, they're going from genes to the brain, and they're looking at these different scales of organization. So from genes to cell types in the brain to the microscale architecture of the brain, to the wiring space or how the connectome is set up, and then these macro scale dynamics. So we go from the wiring of the connectome to the dynamics of the connectome, the functional dynamics. So this is, studying the maturation of cytoarchitecture, connectivity, and functional dynamics across early life. So this is also, there's a developmental component to this as well. So it looks pretty interesting. I'm not sure what they have in terms of publications. It looks like they're doing a lot of, they're doing tool development. They're doing a lot of different types of neuroimaging studies. And they have sort of their vision paper here. Actually, this is a paper where they've been able to establish some models and things like that. And then some other kind of, putting the pieces in place, kind of like what we do with developmental AI. Okay. There's another paper on connectivity and depression. So we have, a connectome, the frontal striatal salience network. It's expanding in cases of depression. So we see in the image here, we have healthy controls and affected brains. We have, showing how this network expands. And then there's some other things here where Trevor and Morgan are having a conversation. Another paper on neurodevelopmental disruptions behind schizophrenia cognitive deficits. So this is from Neuroscience News. Neurodevelopmental disruptions behind schizophrenia cognitive deficits. So a recent review of genetic and population studies reveals that premorbid cognitive deficits in schizophrenia, such as lower IQ, are largely due to neurodevelopmental disruptions rather than inherited genetic variants that directly increase schizophrenia risk. So these are disruptions that are, due to aspects of the environment, aspects of the developmental trajectory. These findings suggest that non-familial factors, including rare genetic mutations and environmental influences, play a significant role in both cognitive impairments and schizophrenia risk. This challenges the long-held belief that cognitive deficits in schizophrenia share the same genetic origins. That's interesting. The research highlights the need to explore early neurodevelopmental disruptions to develop prevention and treatment strategies for both cognitive impairment and schizophrenia. This is the genetics of cognition in schizophrenia, and it's a conceptual review kind of going over different aspects of the genetic predisposition and cognitive impairment as risk factors for schizophrenia, and the factors that influence the degree of cognitive impairment in those with the disorder. There is clear evidence that premorbid cognitive impairment is frequently present in those who develop schizophrenia, and across the range of abilities, poor premorbid cognition is associated with higher liability to the disorder. So this is taken from evidence from genetic and population studies. This shows that premorbid cognitive impairment is a marker for underlying neurodevelopmental risk factors for the disorder, rather than a prodromal manifestation. The premorbid cognitive deficit seems to be largely explained by non-familial factors rather than familial factors, as mentioned in the press release. There is also evidence that neurodevelopmental risk may be better indexed by the degree to which premorbid cognitive ability deviates from familial expectations than by cognitive ability per se. So this is again, restating what was in the press release, or I guess the press release is restating this. This kind of just talks about that. We already went over that. So this is a conceptual review, just kind of shows sort of their model of the relationships here. There's neurodevelopmental impairment that leads to premorbid IQ, familial expectation. This comes from common risk alleles, rare damaging mutations, the environment, and stochastic factors, which can be a number of random factors that are involved. And then this just shows the severity of impairment and then functional outcomes. There's a paper, Genetic Dependent Brain Signatures of Resilience, Interactions Among Childhood Abuse, Genetic Risks and Brain Function. So this is resilience to emotional disorders, but we don't have good signatures of brain resilience. If we want to know anything about how we're resilient to different things in mental health, any trauma that we experience, we don't really have a good measure of the resilience aspect of it. Analyzing brain responses to angry faces in a longitudinally large-scale adolescent cohort, which is this Imagine consortium. We identify two functional networks related to the orbitofrontal and occipital regions as candidate brain signatures of resilience. In girls, but not boys, higher activation in the orbitofrontal network was associated with fewer emotional symptoms following childhood abuse, but only when polygenic burden for depression was high. So this is where if you have high depression burden, if you're a girl, there's higher activation in this frontal network. This finding defined a genetic dependent brain, or GDB signature of resilience. Notably, the GDB signature predicted subsequent emotional disorders in late adolescence, extending into early adulthood, and generalized to another independent prospective cohort, or ABCD. Our findings underscore the genetic modulation of resilient brain connections, laying the foundation for enhancing adolescent mental health through resilience promotion. So they identify these brain networks. They do this in girls and boys. They find these two networks, the frontal and the occipital, and they have different levels, sort of triggers for resilience. So that's interesting. I know that people have studied resilience of brain networks in general. In other words, if you remove nodes from the brain network, how resilient is it? And that's something that you can look at. But looking at resilience through sort of this behavioral metric, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's I'm not seeing it right now. I don't know if I posted this, but again, there's this very strong relationship between adverse childhood experiences and development of psychosis, right?
Yeah.
And there was a recent study using kids, studying kids in Bangladesh who were experiencing severe poverty and a number of other this kind of awful euphemism, adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah.
But relates to this, or it's again like super important to look at as together with the cognitive or these low IQ conditions, which were really prominent in our data set from Oxford, the adolescent psychiatry unit. We had subjects that we had to exclude because their IQ was less than 70.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, which again seems strange to me that because it seemed to be like part of the disorder.
Yeah.
And but again studying these kids that are experiencing severe poverty and associated kind of trauma again, super important because of this relationship, and if you will, an environmental relationship. Much like studying these, there was this awful case in when Romania's communist government fell apart. There were all these kids in orphanages that had been severely neglected, and it became a really important cohort to look at, but in terms of just obviously to try and correct what had been done, as well as just what was possible for the kids that had been in there the longest versus the kids that had kind of only just entered into the program before the government fell. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
It's I loved the California, the first California Surgeon General. I don't think I've mentioned this before, but was only the position was only made like 8 years ago or something like that.
Okay.
So yeah, so like this is a woman appointed by Gavin Newsom, and she was a pediatrician, and when she broke, they kind of set a particular goal, as like a focus of their time as Surgeon General.
Right.
And she set hers to cut adverse childhood experiences in California by 50%.
Okay.
Which there's a bunch of things I loved about that, but from a as someone who's talked with politicians about what can be done for making a difference in mental health. This is something that we know can make a difference, right? Like so many of the things that we have are kind of attempts to manage symptoms later, and certainly not treatment, right? Anyway, that's relates to some of these issues. It's like especially about the that frontal salience paper. Sorry, just thinking about some of the papers.
Yeah.
It's I understand why they think that this is better than the 50 other papers that claim to find a depression marker.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we've seen so many depression markers come and go that we should start to collect the kind of the warning signs of these papers, and as well as just talk about the effectiveness of these like are people who have this circuit signature are interventions better tailored to them, right?
Yeah.
I certainly like the Leanne Williams approach, or attempt. Again, this is someone who's been really leading the way in trying to operationalize precision psychiatry, right? And so she has an annual symposia at Stanford where she brings in people that she's got a. It's always good to see the speakers there because it's people. She's got a great curated list of people that that are trying to do that in their practice wherever they are. Right? All right, and and these are potentially big researchers as part of big health networks and things like that. But it's a real question, how just I certainly want to some of these papers I mark as it's like, let's check on this in 10 years.
Yeah.
Like will this like, okay, so now that if we show this, then what we can there are these stroke treatments, right, where it's just like, if you know the kind of stroke the person has, then you can give them this treatment versus this treatment. One will kill them, and the other will, absolutely save their life.
Right.
Like, I wish I don't want the kill one to be one of those options, but we don't have that in depression.
Right.
We don't have this set of tools where it's just like, we just need to figure out what the what circuit does this person not have working properly, and schizophrenia, the joke is that if schizophrenia was a dopamine disorder, then we would have cured it in the 70s, or something like that, right? Like it and anyway, but I thanks for going through some of those. I it's good to remind us what's getting posted in there. And,
Trevor?
Hello. Yeah, I regret being a little late today. It sounds like I missed out on some really interesting discussion. I was going to ask just your opinion, Morgan. So, over at Stanford, you may be familiar with the SAINT protocol with like TMS therapy. So.
I was just talking about that on Neurotech X's Slack.
Interesting. Well, because if one believes some of the numbers, it's what, like 80+% response rate or something. So I guess I don't know. Like maybe they're like identifying that 20% that doesn't respond would be super useful, but the biomarker stuff I've seen, he said, he has a startup company, perhaps you're familiar with it, where he do a resting state MRI, and then they exactly position it just over the right, part of the left DLPSFD, I think. Anyway, but I was reading another paper that was basically saying the biomarker, at least the RTMS stuff is not really useful at all. But I don't know.
I mean, this is so again, this is one of these things, right, where it's just like, when these treatments come along, by definition, there's a lack of a good sample size, right? Like we, and again, when I talk about shouldn't we perhaps learn from the 30 to 40 years of, supposed biomarker identification and new treatments, again, whenever I see a neuroscience news article that's if it's about schizophrenia, it's almost invariably it's like new schizophrenia treatments, or like groundbreaking treatment or something like that, right? It's just like, how many groundbreaking treatments can you have in a decade? and how many of them in 20 years, are no longer talked about, or are talked about, but they're talked about in a Reddit, in a subreddit, of people, applying it to themselves, right? Right. Which these communities exist, right? So they're again, I try to I try to share this with people, especially in neurotech. I mean, people coming into psychiatry, coming to neurotech, and the people almost building their own TDCS equipment, and then asking on these subreddits, like here are my symptoms, what should I turn the dial up to?
Oh my God.
And for how long, and again, like I read these papers, so it does. I mean, I've got two issues with Saint. One, the fMRI requirement. I just find it I find it hard to believe that that TMS can be so well targeted. It's such a big blast, and the region that you're looking for is somewhat well identified by anatomical anatomical landmarks. Like I feel like you can get within anyway, it's surprising that fMRI targeting personalization would be useful given the modality, or given the stimulation technique, as well as the fact that, again, I just don't know if people control for the fact that when you're in the MRI, you're lying down, and usually when you're doing TMS, you're sitting up, and the brain shifts. And I don't know if anybody controls for that, but and then I mean, Saint, is just let's do it faster, stronger, in a shorter amount of time. The numbers are remarkable, and I hope in 10 years that those match up, or do we see what again has been seen many times in psychiatry, where there's this fall off, over time, in terms of the effectiveness of some new treatment, as it's applied more widely, and whatever it was about, perhaps the population being studied or something like that. But this is like I of course hope that it is hitting that effectiveness, right? And as you said, like it's definitely, you definitely want to see, like, what is it about those others that aren't responding? I think it's interesting to start looking at the same groups that, it would be, again, wonderful, but difficult to do, to, take the kinds of people that get recommended for ECT, and to do Saint, to randomize Saint and ECT across the same subjects, right?
Yeah.
And because that's for a lot of reasons, right? In terms of these are people that have been tried on several other drugs.
I guess, is it possible that, I just kind of view it through a cynical lens, but perhaps there's a realization that the primary driver of the efficacy might just be, like you were saying, the duration and the compressed treatment, and that's just not really like the protocol probably has limitations in its like patentability and like commercialization, and so I guess that's my suspicion where the resting state fMRI comes in, because then it becomes like a whole different thing, and it's like then you have to have like a certified places, and then you need to really I think you have to have like 7T or at least a 3T MRI.
No. It's not nothing. Yeah, I don't think even 7T is approved clinically yet.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay, so it's got to be 3T then.
I believe it's still considered research grade, but certainly 3T is fine. Like there's nothing that fancy about what they're asking for in terms of the scan. But you're right. It is one of those things where it's just like it does kind of look designed to be novel enough that like it doesn't. Yeah, it can. I mean, I don't know if patented is the right word, but its IP can be maintained, and again, I haven't seen the evidence in terms of the requirement of the fMRI neuronavigation, but like having spent some of this week working with some neuronavigation, it's a little it's a bit of an art, and again, I'm still, this came up in terms of the way the brain sits in fluid, the Neuralink threads, right? So Neuralink switched its most recent, they've done these human trials, right? I mean, I think 2 at this point. But the first patient, they remove part of the skull. They have these threads that go, then so they replace that part of the skull with this the device and electronics, and then you've got threads that go into the tissue. And I think they said within quite a short amount of time, I forget now if it was weeks or months, but something like 80% of the threads had pulled out, right? It was still effective, for the tasks, which is saying something. But I believe that they said it was like 80% pulled because as the head's moving, the brain is moving, right? Which again, and the greatest shift is basically between lying down and sitting up, right? And I'm pretty sure all the neuronavigation systems I've seen, they take your MRI, which is done lying down, and they apply it to the person sitting up, and so I can point to this medical Medical University, South Carolina, Musk, not the same one. That was doing EEG in a magnet, and what they showed was that if they did EEG in the magnet versus EEG sitting in a chair, that there was this dipolar shift. I forget the task now. I don't know if maybe it was just even like finger tapping or something like that, but it was something that was, pretty superior and then in the magnet they saw this shift back, like 20 degrees or something like that. Anyway, it just speaks to this, like, is the neuronavigation really? And yeah. Anyway, I want to follow up on it, for sure. And we're looking at it. There's a number of companies here in the Bay Area that are doing this TFUS, focused ultrasound, and the certainly the desire with the focused ultrasound is that you better than electrical, TES or TMS, you can actually, hit a very small, like an fMRI like voxel size. And my question then is just, like how well can you hit that in terms of given brain shift and given what would be a good demonstration, like in terms of functional activation modulation, right? But it's super interesting, and I know one of these groups that she talked at the California Neurotechnology Conference. That's the student-run neurotech conference here. I forget. I think her company's Sandmine. Anyway, but they're looking at generalized anxiety disorder with, again, I think a subcortical target, but I don't know if that's been announced. But the interesting thing about the subcortical targets is, of course, that's where you'd expect less shift. like it would potentially be on that axis would the subcortical would move the least. The cortical, especially at the top of the head, would move the most.
I think there's an argument to be made too that the subcortical target may have more evolutionary conservation with the preclinical model.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you saw this. I thought this was really interesting. Like one of my favorite YouTube channels is Machine Learning Street Talk, and which usually interviews machine learning people, right? But this like yesterday or a couple of days ago, it was Mark Solms. I don't know if you're familiar, but it's a neuropsychologist, and he was talking about it was talking a lot about the differences between cortical and subcortical and brainstem regions, talking a lot about experiments with decorticated cats and things like that, and a lot of good stuff that only, it's the kind of thing that only neuropsychologists talk about. Like, if we remove this, then the person can still do that. But it's a really interesting point, right? Because I've been in some strange discussions recently about what happens to people when they're missing a cortex, and as he points out, like in animals they can still do quite a lot of stuff. Yeah, and so maybe it's not best to say that the cortex is the seat of the soul.
That's interesting. I've been looking quite a bit at this ultrasound stuff, and so there are some limitations with the focused ultrasound stuff. It involves like the intensity and like the response time. Ben Sorum at Rowan University there's a particular protein that it targets, but
just in terms of its like neural activation.
Right. Yeah. So there's I think it's like ASIC1 or ASIC3 something. That's the Hugo the gene target. But it's like this. It's expressed in a lot of neurons, not every neuron, but in a lot of them, and it's thought to be the primary driver of like you have to be really specific when you're talking about the focus ultrasound, because like what intensity are you talking about, what frequency, what stimulus pattern, but this seems to be the one that when people are talking about clinical things, that it's usually driving the activity, but it's not necessarily really ideal for a lot of potential like use cases. And so I'm sure you're familiar with sonogenetics, this idea of like introducing new stuff. And so I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity there. And I don't want to dominate the conversation or anything, but I would love to. You were asking, what's the what's that you said like functional activation, or maybe in common parlance, the killer app or something like that. And I guess I've been thinking about that. I have some ideas. But,
there's definitely like combining it with other kinds of drug delivery, or again, like focus ultrasound like is already useful in cancer, in terms of destroying tumors, right? So it's just like it's already useful, or certainly that's how I was introduced to it, by surgeons that were again focused on its its tumor killing ability, and then this ability to allow the blood-brain barrier to open up the blood-brain barrier temporarily, and have it kind of reheal after you've delivered whatever, like that's super interesting. And then these newer things where you're potentially using it to do a really targeted delivery, where you're now, again, Build a Cell seminar is such a great series, was talking this week about synthetic cells and synthetic vesicles, right? And the ability to use these as again, these like targeted with molecular logic, or they've now attached to something, or they've now they've got a receptor for something, and then the vesicle opens, or the vesicles deliver. So it's really interesting, some of the abilities to say combine these, but these are all things that again we understand kind of well mechanistically, right? Whereas like schizophrenia in particular, or the early papers that we were talking about, or Bradley was just reading from the Computational Psychiatry channel, is just getting at these these issues in the genetics of schizophrenia that relate to hundreds of genes that that are involved in neurodevelopment, right? And so you've got like such a high dimensional space that in which these are being used, and again then you throw in kind of 11 multiscale problem solving in terms of so say you've got these 50 particular alleles, that's just creating a situation where the cells will then respond in God knows what ways, but they will start developing differently because of those alleles versus these 50 other different ones, right? And yeah, so it's just really, so much we need to do in terms of the brain organogenesis, which gets us to the other channel.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I think that's good. And yeah, so we did. Trevor kind of came in late, but we did review the computational psychiatry channel, so that's got a lot of good stuff in it. We should try to do that more and look and see what's there and kind of work through it like this. This is great. So yeah, and I think there's more to say about this, so we should do that in the channel, and maybe next week we can kind of revisit this. Maybe we'll do the brain organoids channel next week because there's a lot of good stuff in there as well. So a couple things, kind of odds and ends, and then I'm going to get into a really interesting topic on a talk that I saw this week. The first one here is this handbook, Routledge Handbook on the Philosophy of Scientific Modeling, which I thought was a really nice. This is a free ebook. I mean, you can download it from Taylor and Francis Philosophical Handbook. So it's on the philosophy of scientific modeling, and it's kind of an interesting set of topics. So we have different types of chapters on theories and models, the emergence of the modeling attitude, practice-oriented approaches to modeling, and then some topics like representation, idealization, de-idealization, which means idealizing a problem or de-idealizing a problem as they define it here. Models, fiction, and the imagination. So if you build a model, it can be hyper realistic. It can be sort of building an imaginary thing in some ways. Some interesting philosophical topics. Target systems, minimal models, which is like modeling the minimal number of parts that you need to really kind of represent a system in a reasonable manner. So a lot of times when we do biological modeling, we do a lot of minimal modeling, and that's considered good enough. Computer simulations, scientific laws and theoretical models, the puzzle of model-based explanation, and then there's this part on methodological aspects of robustness analysis, model evaluation when you're evaluating different models, models, data models and big data, models and measurement, model transfer in science. And then related topics kind of going off into different areas related to modeling. Scientific models and thought experiments looks good. Models and maps, metaphors, analogies, and models. And of course, this is stuff we talked about many times before. Interdisciplinarity through modeling. And then modeling in the wild, part 5, kind of talking about different applications of models in finance, climate, different epistemic applications of machine learning models, biomedical models, modeling history, the deep past, formal language theory, and how network models contribute to science. So I think a really nice set of chapters there. This is, again, this Routledge Handbook on Philosophy of Scientific Modeling. So it's a really nice reference, especially for a lot of the philosophical issues we talk about in the group here. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is that Neuromatch, which of course offers their summer schools on neuro AI and deep learning and computational neuroscience, is now opened a course in open science. So I'm glad to see this because, this is a topic that sort of, there's been a lot of hype around it, but there isn't a really good curriculum around it, at least not yet. And so this is where kind of they're getting into Open Science 101 to teach people how to do open science. So open science is really a practice-oriented thing. It's, doing good practice to make your science open and transparent, as well as accessible to other people. So that could mean, open protocols, open papers like preprints, other types of things where you're just making your science transparent and giving access to people of the finished product. So the way they approach open science is that it's a 5-day course, so it's like the 1 week, so it's not as long as the other courses that they offer, which I think is about the right size for what we're doing here. The first day is the ethos of open science. So this is just kind of like describing, how to think about this space, how people are doing things, in the open science landscape. Where do you fit in? A lot of times, open science is sort of a continuum. So sometimes groups will engage in open science. Maybe they'll just preprint their papers. Sometimes they'll, go a step further and make their protocols open, which means that you don't bury your protocol in a paper. You maybe make videos. You put like interactive notebooks together and put them prominently online and things like that. Sometimes people will actually do things like, share reagents or, provide open data sets from their experiments. That's also open science. So there's a continuum of open science. This just kind of talks about, how open science works, what are the principles, and then what are the benefits to the people doing it. So typically, groups will do open science to different degrees. The research group will maybe open up, do one thing in open science like preprints, or a lot of things that might be heavily invested in it. And so it really depends on what the benefit to the group is. Sometimes, you can incentivize people. A lot of funding agencies, for example, have, mandated that, people release their papers as preprints, or mandated that data be provided, in an open repository. So those are ways that, you can kind of facilitate open science, but also showing groups that there's a clear benefit to doing this, that it produces better science, that it helps the community sort of learn from what you're doing. And if everyone does this, it's a very virtuous cycle. And so, then they talk about the current challenges in open science landscape. So, the current challenges basically are, maintaining different repositories, different tools. There's a cost, of course, to opening up your data sets, for creating preprints, creating preprint servers, and how do we sort of overcome that? A lot of the challenges, of course, are also in terms of career evaluation. So if you, participate in open science, you're spending a lot of time on these activities. Are they rewarded by promotion and tenure committees? Or, do people think that preprints are worth citing? Things like that. So there's a lot of practicality in the ethos aspect, even though the term ethos is used. It's actually a very practical set of considerations. Then day 2 is open tools and resources. This is where you have the essential tools and resources of practicing open science. The exploration of the use, make, share framework. So this is where you use something, you make something, you share something. So if I create a data set and I put it up, in a repository to make it open to people, those people, I make something and then I share it, and then other people can use it. And, the idea would be that would be a reciprocal thing. So other groups that might use data might make a resource and then share it with me, and I can use it. So that's the idea behind use, make, share. And it's really, based on this idea of a Creative Commons. And so, you're dealing with the grist for a virtuous cycle, which is good. And then the immediate applications of open science tools, which of course, where you have databases, you have preprint servers, you have, places where you can make open protocols, open interactive notebooks for code, things like that. A3 is open data. So this is just kind of going through how open data is used and how, you create something like a data management plan, which is something that I think the NIH and NSF require for grants. where you have to describe how you're going to manage your data. So a lot of times when you get a grant, like a large grant, a multi-year grant, but even if you have a smaller grant, if you generate data, you should have a management plan in place. In other words, if you just generate data and just use it once and dump it out, or just put it in a folder somewhere and forget about it, that's not good. That's what they call the file drawer problem, because you've basically cherry picked your data that you generated, and then you don't let anyone else see it. So it has very limited utility. And of course, when a funding agency is paying for people to basically generate data, that's not great. It's not a great use of our money. And so what you need to do instead is to have a plan. We're going to manage our data. We're going to sort of, first of all, have a method for making sure that the data is robust, that you don't have a lot of problems with people making up data, or less nefariously mismanaging the data so that it's not reproducible. But also being able to take the data, annotate it, curate it, and then maybe share it in an open repository. So a lot of genomic data, that's been a requirement for years, where if you do a genomic study, you usually upload the data to NCBI, and it's available for other people to use. You also have a lot of metadata with it so that people can actually use it in context. And so that's what kind of data management plan that a lot of funding agencies require. And I think it's a good thing to have, just even if you're not applying for a grant, because it allows you to establish a data pipeline. It allows you to establish, what you're doing with the data and how you can get the maximum use out of your data. Then there's some best practices involved in sharing and citing open data, which are, that's what they go over there. Then there's open code day 4. So then they get into like kind of, you have a couple of components of a research grant. You have the data collection, the data generation, and usually you'll write some code, or you'll manage code to do an analysis or to actually collect the data. And so this is where open code comes in. And so then, they talk about open code. This is not quite the same thing as open source software, because, you're not you're not engineering on a software artifact, but you are managing code. Sometimes it's, in a defined program. Sometimes you're writing your own programs, but you're basically having to develop protocols for sharing code, managing code, debugging code, refactoring code if necessary. Those are all important things. And then finally, open results. So this is where you're sharing your results with the community of science. You're trying to figure out how to report them. So some people just kind of use a paper format. Of course, we can preprint things, which means that you can maybe publish smaller chunks of results, or you can publish them very quickly and get feedback on them. You can also publish, smaller reports that aren't, they're not publishable units, but they can be published as maybe things that are negative results or other things that you find interesting. And so this is all very nice curriculum. I teach some of these things in my project management course. I have a lecture on open data. I have some things in open science and open source software that I like this topic, and I think they've done a good job of kind of going, especially for the practicing scientists, to take this 1-week course so they can learn a lot about this in a condensed way. So this is happening in October, November, and December. So they have 3 sessions once a month, or each of the next 3 months. Okay, so that's on open science. Now I wanted to get into this. Okay, let's see if I can find this. So I went to this, I saw this talk on YouTube. This is the Santa Fe series. So Stanislaw Ulam was a complexity theorist who was around the mid-century. And he did a lot of interesting work as a mathematician, physicist. He's kind of considered sort of a father of complexity theory. And so they have this series of talks at Santa Fe Institute in tribute to him. And one of the people who gave a talk was David Krakauer, who's a faculty member at SFI. And he's published this book called The Complex World. So this is an introductory book to the foundations of complexity science. And so David Krakauer gave this talk. He was, kind of going through the history of complexity theory, some interesting asides about like the history of science, in terms of like the way people thought about different mechanisms. So, for example, he made the point that like Darwin originally thought of natural selection as sort of a steam engine. And he never published that analogy, but he used that analogy. In fact, in the 19th century, a lot of people used the steam engine analogy for different things. Sometimes it was on base, like, if you're working in statistical mechanics at the time, if you're James Clerk Maxwell, you use the steam engine as a metaphor. It's pretty appropriate. If you use it for natural selection, maybe not so much. But, he went through some of these aspects of the history of science. And kind of the point of that was to show that sort of complexity theory is born out of the theory of machines. We talked about some of these kind of metaphors, talking about the machine metaphor in particular in our cognition futures group. So we've had that discussion there. But I thought it was interesting in light of that. But anyways, this is the book that he's written. So this book is available. This talk is available on YouTube more generally. And so this is what I'm going to talk about now. So, so this is the talk, The Complex World, 3 Centuries of Deliberation. It's really about the history of science leading up to complexity theory and thinking about complex systems. This is a nice table that he had in, I think it's from the book. This is about kind of how people have thought about systems theory, different citations of this. And it's very heavy on the cybernetics, which is interesting. He just showed this table in the talk. So there are these different references that he gives, and he gives this kind of definition of how they think about dynamic systems or complexity or systems, and kind of the ontology or domain. So it's in different areas of science, and then the stated field. So, for example, there's Rosenbluth, Wiener, and Bigelow. This is the 1943 paper where they kind of I can't remember the name of it right now, but this is, of course, a classic cybernetics paper, which isn't mentioned here. But the way they view systems are as dynamical systems with active or purposeful behavior. So this is this paper where they talk about purpose and cybernetics, directed towards the attainment of a goal, quote unquote, voluntary activity supported by feedback and prediction. And this is where we talk about cybernetic systems being extrapolative. So, cybernetic systems have feedback. There's this trajectory that's produced, and it can adapt basically to its conditions. So it's extrapolative. In other words, it can maybe anticipate things, or it can produce an adaptive feedback. This was, of course, in the philosophy of science, at least nominally, and now, of course, it's part of this larger systems conversation. Hayek from 1945 thought about markets. He thought about, free markets and self-organized economies and things like that. And he was talking about systems planning through local decentralized knowledge of time and place, markets in the price system, spontaneous sources of order. And this is, of course, resource allocation and the economy and society and this is from the economics literature. Warren Weaver, who of course is another, he was a popular writer, but he wrote a lot about cybernetics and information theory. This is actually the first instance of complexity science. So this is Weaver's definition: systems of organized complexity, sizable numbers of factors which are interrelated into an organic or functional whole. So again, we have these themes of like purposeful behavior, adaptive feedback, we have decentralization, we have this sort of spontaneous order, we have organized complexity, and functional wholes. So this is where, we have all these themes kind of emerging. Again, Wiener, this is Norbert Wiener in 1948. So this is not Weaver, this is Wiener. And this is from sort of the cybernetics literature, of course, more directly. And his definition is systems controlling functional information through feedback to achieve homeostasis. There's homeostasis. Stability and goal seeking. So whereas Rosenbluth, Wiener, and Bigelow were talking about voluntary activity and purposeful behavior, Wiener 1948 talks about stability and goal seeking. The similar kind of mechanism. Von Bertalanffy, who's another basically kind of adjacent cyberneticist, did a lot of things with general systems theory. He was interested in open systems, dynamic equilibrium, efficient metabolism, principle of equifinality, thermodynamics of irreversibility. So him and Prigogine in 1947 were building on this idea of a thermodynamic interpretation. So there are a lot of these different. Von Forester gives a theory of observers, description invariant subjective worlds, representational systems, recursive and self-referential systems. This is the epistemology of living things. Anderson's paper, 1972, More is Different. This is a nice paper. This is usually considered the foundational paper of complexity science, but it's basically talking about like emergence and reductionism as being sort of bad. And so in More is Different, the focus is on complex systems dominated by broken symmetries. Reductionism does not imply constructionism. Each level requires a different conceptual structure. So that sort of frames that sort of thinking in complexity science. We have Herbert Simon, John Holland, talking about different types of social and biological systems. Condon and Ashby in 1970, talking about regulatory systems, feedback control, prediction, inference, and complexity of control or matching that of environment. So this is the ever regulator theorem paper. And then finally, Varela, Maturana, and Uribe, 1974, where they introduce autopoiesis, which has a lot of these same features. So he goes through these different papers from different areas of science and sort of how they come together to inform modern complexity theory. This is another figure where he talks about, this is sort of the 19th century matrix of these different themes emerging out of the work of these 19th century luminaries. You have Poincaré and Maxwell in the dynamics and control corner. You have Darwin, Mendel, and Wallace in the evolution and adaptation corner. You have Maxwell, Boltzmann, Carnot, Clausius, and Gibbs in the StatMech and thermodynamics quadrant. And then finally Boole, Babbage, and Lovelace in the computation and logic quadrant. So there were these four things that were happening in the 19th century. You had in one, of course, we had the theory of natural selection. We had the foundations of evolutionary theory. We had the foundations of biological adaptation. We also had the foundations of dynamics and control. This is again the work, mathematics work, natural history, mathematics, computation and logic, which was again mathematics at the time, and as well as philosophy. You had that in another quadrant, And then statistical mechanics and thermodynamics were also emerging at that time. And you had a number of people working on those problems. So you could see all these different areas that were kind of emerging in the 19th century coming together in different ways to be a foundation for complexity theory. This is an article in Aeon magazine online that Krakauer wrote with, I think, Chris Kempes, who's another Santa Fe professor. Chris Kempes works at the intersection of physics, biology, and the earth sciences. And together they published this article on problem-solving matter. So this is an argument that, I mean, we've actually had this conversation as well in our group. We did the stuff on physical computation, which I talked about earlier, but also, on and off again in some of the cognition futures and cybernetics meetings that we've had. So their argument here is kind of, I guess, controversial, and you'll see in a little bit why it's controversial. Life is starting to look a lot less like an outcome of chemistry and physics and more like a computational process. So this is the argument that they're making. And so if you think back to those definitions of complexity theory, some of those, of course, maybe are directly applicable to sort of, what we think of as life and the evolution of life and the development of life. And some of them are less relevant. But, making the connection there, what is the connection between, say, like computational processes and this sort of complex system like life? So, and then maybe another question is, are all complex systems equal? In other words, can we assume universality between all types of complex systems? We assume that a computational system is equivalent to a biological system. Can we use the same language to describe it? And that would mean, of course, that life could be a computational process, or more generally, that we can use the same language to describe all manner of complex systems. So this is, their article here, kind of talking about what makes computation possible. Of course, naturally, we have modern computers and, digital computing, but of course, it goes way beyond that. There are a lot of different aspects of computation that go back to the Jacquard loom in 1804. If you were an off-world engineer and you were visiting Earth at different points in time and looking at the different technologies, we know that like in the 1940s and beyond, we had digital computers that were pretty straightforward in terms of the way we think of computation today. But if you go back another century, in 1804, the Jacquard loom was patented. And maybe, if you were an off-world engineer, you would think that computation was about the sort of the plant matter and insect excreta used to make the wooden frames, punch cards, and silk threads involved in fabric weaving looms. And this is maybe an analog or a precursor to modern programmable machines. So a loom may be a computational device. And you can go back in history and look at other things that may be computational devices as well. And they don't have to be, of the sort of the modern computer. They can be any sort of thing that processes information that, you can program, that is automated. There are a number of things you could define as a computer. So this just kind of goes through this, talking about kind of how, we're kind of developing biological computers. We're developing programmable DNA, programmable cells, things like that. And of course, now we're sort of straddling life. So could we, say, maybe life is a computational process, and we're just simply tapping into that with something like synthetic biology. Or it could be that we're hacking a physiochemical system, and we're imposing that sort of metaphor on the system because of our goal. So that's, something that, food for thought there. Just kind of talking about, this sort of model, and talking about how biological systems involved, things like problem solving. Now, they have this quote that we're going to talk about in a little bit. And this is maybe a problem for this sort of point of view. Genetic evolution also involved problem solving. Insect wings solve the problem in quotes of flight. And so that's, a specific way of looking at evolution as sort of this retrospective thing. And that may be a problem because evolution isn't necessarily retrospective. In other words, you could look at it as like that there's a niche that's, flight that organisms might use to get away from predators. And so, insects might evolve wings that solve a problem. But of course, evolution doesn't really solve problems in that way. Flight is a consequence of having wings. If you have wings that allow you to fly and you can occupy that niche and it improves your fitness, then great. If not, there may be no actual problem of flight. So there's a problem there with kind of the way that's conceptualized. He also talks about some of the first experimental evidence for sort of the origins of life, talking about the Miller-Urey experiment, where they tried to recreate the atmospheric conditions of early Earth and put a bunch of organic compounds in that environment, and then looked at what kinds of chemicals were synthesized. And so they actually did, this is a very complex sort of line of research because they did the original study and they were able to get these life supporting compounds. And then of course they had to redo the experiment because they didn't get the atmospheric mix right. And then many years later, I guess it was one of the students of, I think it was Stanley Miller, received those materials when their supervisors retired, and they redid the experiment, and they actually got a better result. They actually got a more robust result from the experiment. So this is an interesting set of experiments. But basically, this is showing that you can actually reconstruct the conditions for early life, the chemical conditions and things like that. I guess this is pointing towards the idea of adaptive function. And so this is where you have this, they kind of link this to problem solving more generally. So, this is maybe an artifact of the Santa Fe Institute, the way they view, these kind of evolutionary systems, but and then link it to technology. But problem solving may or may not be the way to do that. And so this is really the core of their argument, though, that this problem-solving perspective is radically altering our knowledge of the universe. Life is starting to look a lot less like an outcome of chemistry and physics, more like a computational process. And so, they go back to the origins of computational processes, back to Aristotle, talking about, how functions take precedence over forms. And so going over this. And then kind of linking that to modern evolutionary theory and, kind of thinking about, there was kind of a paradigm shift at that point by, where before Darwin, people looked at organisms by their material components in chemistry. And after Darwin, they started to view organisms as defining traits by focusing on how organisms adapted and evolved. So, in other words, how they processed and solved problems. I mean, I don't know if that really follows, but that's sort of the idea that they had, that there is a shift from this sort of stamp collecting sort of thing where you would just describe the organism to thinking about the organism functionally. And then if the organism is a functional entity, it can actually do things like process information and solve problems. And so this is something that, also has its roots in early computing as well. So this is the article, goes on, kind of interesting. They have a screenshot of the Avita software. So they're showing this artificial life program that allows you to evolve genotypes and then, select for certain genotypes. And it runs on the basis of these genotypes that have logical functions that that basically solve problems given the right computational resources. So they develop these competencies through these logical functions, and given the right environment of computational resources, they can reproduce and dominate a population of programs. So this is kind of thinking about these kind of programming-oriented models of life. Von Neumann's construction replication model is another example of this, where you can build an evolutionary model that's Turing complete and simulate life, and it looks very similar to the kind of life that exists in the natural world. He talks about constructor theory, which is, of course, from David Deutsch in 2013. This is the paper here on the archive. This is constructor theory, and it's basically a theory that seeks to express all fundamental scientific theories in terms of a dichotomy between possible and impossible physical transformations, those that can be caused to happen and those that cannot. So definitely, there's some sort of assumptions here that you have to kind of buy into. So this is this kind of goes on for a while. Talks about free energy and things like that. But I guess the point I wanted to make is that this is, I think, a pretty good article, pretty well staking out this claim. But it isn't without its criticism. So this is Philip Ball, who's a science writer, who writes on a lot of chemistry and biology. And he was reviewing this article, and he was kind of making some points here. This is on X, of course. And so the first post is a post to the link to the paper. And then the second post here is, I'm less sure whether it's right to see the evolutionary process as problem solving. For example, insect wings solve the problem of flight, which was in the paper. So the idea that insect wings respond to this problem, this abstract problem out in the world that has to be solved, which isn't necessarily the right framing. And that's what Philip says. I don't think that's the right framing, not least because it has a strong whiff of teleology. So we talk about teleology in cybernetics and how that's basically, that there's this sort of, force that guides the things towards the future, or, that there's this necessarily temporal organization that, necessarily leads to things. So this is one of the problems with this kind of framing of solving problems that don't really exist in the world. Like, there may be an advantage to evolving things that allow you to fly, but saying that it's the problem of flight is very much like phrasing it as a technological problem. And in doing so, you introduce this teleological explanation, which is to say that there's maybe some sort of computational force in the universe that governs everything, and that you're kind of solving for that, which is, not necessarily the way I don't know if you just have to be comfortable with that or what, but it's a point of view that, it may not be justified. So Philip then later says here, flight is not a problem that evolution must solve. That's a retrospective construction. So this is like, retrospective. You're thinking about the effect, and thinking about it as the cause. So if life is starting to look ... like a computational process, is that life the organism or the evolutionary process? So, is the evolutionary process life, or is it the organism that's life that has an evolutionary process because it's interacting with other organisms or its environment? So those are very different considerations. So, it's not just the problem of, that it's teleology and that it's retrodictive, but it's also this sort of, conflating life as the environment or as the evolutionary process with life as the organism. If we go back to the Miller-Urey experiment, what is the thing that sort of, is there a computational process underlying that? Well, it's a chemical problem. There's chemical synthesis going on. There's an environment in which the chemical synthesis operates, but there's no predetermined outcome. And, you could probably run that experiment many times and maybe get different results. So is that also a computational process? We know that there are a lot of papers on replaying the tape of life. And, you can look that term up and you can find different papers on it. And it's basically, if we could run the experiment of life again and again and again, if we could run the experiment of life from the origin of life on Earth to the modern world of the tree of life, what would the outcome always be the same? And the answer is no, it wouldn't. And that's, I think, pretty much the consensus, because evolution is extremely contingent and extremely stochastic. And you have these, you're going to have this variation in what's generated. And there's a case to be made that there's certain phenotypes that occur over and over again. But that's, that's maybe a problem of constraints more than of retrodiction. Well, anyways, the last thing he mentions here is that most of all, it feels crucial to maintain a distinction between what evolution does and what living things do. I have no problem with considering organisms as problem-solving, as goal-directed entities they must be. Okay, so if you're saying that organisms are goal-directed entities, you must say that they're problem-solving. Although thinking about like organisms as problem solvers behaving in an environment, an immediate environment, is much different than thinking about their evolution over many generations. And because there are, different aspects like, genotype, phenotype, there's behavior, but also because those conditions change a lot. And so problem solving is sort of the idealized case where, you can solve a local problem like finding food, surviving in a certain environment. But if the environment is always changing, then you're just, is that really, does that problem solving really give you this huge, advantage in the long term? So there's some interesting points here to think about. And so, yeah, that was my experience with that talk.
Yeah. If you don't mind going back, the one just before that.
This one?
Yes. Taking Hayek seriously.
Oh, yeah. This is, I don't really think this is related to the post.
Yeah. I mean, but so sorry. I mean, one, it's a funny username.
Yeah, I do.
I mean, as well as the fact that the username is Frederick Hayek.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
got a blue check mark. Which again, Twitter's changed.
Yeah, typical X stuff.
But it is so hard, and Philip Ball's a biologist, right?
He's a science writer who's got a background in chemistry and biology.
He's a chemistry.
Yeah, chemistry. I think more.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question in terms of how do you take if you take the multi-organism view.
Yeah.
Right, or like the genealogy, like the many generations, right?
Yeah.
Like, what would you say evolution is doing?
Right.
Right, like and at any particular time, you wouldn't say evolution is problem solving, but
right.
the history gives you something that is certainly adaptive, right?
Right.
Or it's a learning of sorts, right? Or
well,
so it's so I hate to say maybe taking Hayek seriously is right.
Well, I think a good way to think about it, and maybe a good way to think about learning more generally.
it's just that, you know, that you do fall into these kind of language problems,
Right,
you know,
right.
in discussing it, and these kind of difficulties in taking, or, you know, that language has the language around evolution's operation is problematic,
Yeah.
because it's yeah,
Yeah.
you have to like see it from a very big picture,
Yeah.
and think about it in organismal terms.
Yeah.
Like it's not about it's about the generations, and certainly, sorry, that's, I don't know if you can hear my daughter screaming upstairs. I don't know why. Yeah, I've been like, Dennis Noble's been dropping lots of videos on YouTube, and you know, and again, it's sometimes I think he as well fall, you know, that what we're having here is a failure to communicate, and that it's just that. I mean,
well, yeah. So
the wing is a the wing makes it even more complicated.
yeah. I mean, one way to think about evolution and maybe learning more generally is like you don't always succeed. In fact, maybe it's very rare that you succeed. So if you have a population of organisms and they're all sort of problem solving, you know, some will problem solve better than others, maybe, or maybe they'll just find a solution that's better. And in finding solution doesn't necessarily mean it's just driven by behavior. You have, you know, genes for certain traits. You have certain variation in the environment across the population, and so you get these opportunities to sort of proliferate and solve a problem. When in fact, it's not solving a problem the way we might think of it in terms of cognition alone. You know, we think about problem solving as like an active process of, you know, cognition, or that there's a goal that the organism is moving towards, when in fact all they're trying to do is survive in their immediate environment. So over time that compounds, but it's not like, you know, there's this overarching thing where, oh yeah, I got to evolve to be like a beetle, or I have to evolve to be a human. You know, it's not right.
Absolutely right. I mean, this became clear. I guess it was like 2 weeks ago, and seeing this company that is trying to make these, you know, basically brainless organisms.
Yeah.
Right. Like trying to edit. You know, what they want to do is you know, edit anatomy. Right?
Yeah.
And there's, you know, and of course that's just not how
Right.
that's not how, you know, genetic control of morphogenesis works.
Yeah.
Right. So you know, so what they ended up doing, it's super interesting, and you know, happy to talk about it at some point, because again, it's interesting from a, you know, because they're focused on brain. It's definitely of interest in neurodevelopment kind of standpoint.
Yeah.
But it's interesting as just a developmental biology standpoint, in the sense that, again, there's not some blueprint where, you know, here's the body, and it's just like, okay, now I got to make this, right?
Right.
The expression patterns are, you know, much more abstract than that.
Yeah.
Right. And you know, and in kind of in the noble, you know, context, like are making all, you know, they're not even making these assumptions about it. They just know that if they turn on, then that because of context, that they will, you know, get the right thing, because, you know, because they had an ancestor that did.
Right.
That ancestor was able to survive, right? But that you end up with these, again, and this comes back to, of course, schizophrenia and its genes, its risk factor genes, where it's just like you've got hundreds of these genes that are making all these kind of like micro decisions in a sense. But those expressions at the right time are what give us the morphogenesis that we expect, or again, like the problem solving is good enough that we get an organism that can behave, right?
Yeah.
And and again, and each one is a miracle, or each one's pretty damn special. But yeah, it's as usual. As soon as we get into the teleological discussions, it becomes philosophy.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. No, so like,
I mean, that we end up arguing about terms,
Well, I think we can revisit the whole nature as computation argument, because we've talked about this before, where is nature sort of computational, and if it's not computational, can we still understand it with like the sort of the complexity theory view, or the sort of the computationalist view, where maybe we can draw an analogy with some other system, maybe even like an engineered system, and kind of use the same arguments. I think that's important because maybe there is some universality at the level of like systems dynamics, and it's like all systems basically, if you evolve, there's a certain type of complexity where things recombine, or there are things that sort of form independent trajectories, and there are all these different aspects that you can list of like an evolutionary system that are maybe analogous to like a generative computational system. I mean, it's not the same thing, but it has enough of the same components to make it look very similar. And that's like with Avita, that's the thing that a lot of times you'll look at it and it looks like life. It's not a living system, but it looks like it. Right. So it's doing something similar, but what is it?
Right. Yeah. These yeah. I mean, right. These useful abstractions that are capturing something. For sure. Sorry, I was just thinking of another. It was interesting tissue talks this week from the kind of one of the people I think that kind of maybe founded the Weiss Institute. Anyway, it was a synthetic biology talk, but it covered things like the foundation of Moderna and things like that. But just talking about, like, on one hand, our ability to engineer biology, and on the other hand, our real ignorance still in our ability to engineer biology, and that there's this complexity that or certainly that life is able to do all these things in such a both sophisticated and yet beautiful way that we still have no idea how to control at this point. And it was really nice talk. I forget the it was a really nice overview of synthetic biology since like 2000.
Wow. Yeah. If you could drop that in the Slack, I think that'd be great.
Yeah. I'm just.
Trevor, do you want to say something, or? Jesse?
Yeah, I was going to add a couple words. That's all right. So, I mean, it was kind of alluded to, but not so much. I think survival can be framed as problem solving. So,
Yeah.
there's kind of been this schismogenesis of trying to separate the two. One could call perhaps some of the arguments here like higher, if you were to make a hierarchy, this would just be higher up on the totem pole of perhaps survival.
Yeah.
And so it's just, what level of abstraction are we talking about? And I guess the other thing that was just occurring to me is, one of these ideas from Chris Field, and I don't know how much of it is originally from him. I linked to it. I guess in the computational psychiatry channel, Morgan and I were having a conversation, and I linked to YouTube on it. But he basically, he really is a strong proponent of this idea of quantum computation, and especially on a cellular level. And so when we start kind of drawing these lines of, organismal level versus cellular, I think that can be potentially problematic because I suspect there might be a way of looking at this where you even you might be able to go smaller than a cell, but starting on a cellular level, there may be evidence of computation happening in pursuit of goals, perhaps like survival. And one of the other main points that Field is making is that he has a theoretical basis for thinking that cells or life had to master time before mastering space. And so, which is a really curious thing, because, when we're talking about these problem solving, a lot of these things are like time-based goals. And, if we're listening to what these theoreticians are saying, they're saying, life actually did that first before it started doing space. And so, yeah, just some food for thought, yeah.
I'm not, I know Chris Field's work, but I'm not that familiar with it. So that would be interesting to go back into some of the work that he's done on that.
Yeah, I mean, he's very interesting, very broad researcher. Like I saw that he gave a talk this week at the Topos Institute.
Okay.
he gave a talk this week on the Topos Institute on the identity operator, I think was the title of his talk.
Yeah.
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah.
I was trying to find. I'll try and find that link, Bradley.
Okay.
For the tissue talk this week.
The next thing, or the last thing I'm going to talk about is, so there's this interesting special issue of I don't know what journal this. Oh, this is. So it's this interesting special issue of this journal, Possibility Studies in Society. And again, in our Cognition Futures group, we've talked a lot about enactivism and how enactivism is, you can define enactivism, but it's its applications are kind of all over the place. But this is an interesting kind of approach to enactivism. So this is a thematic section of Possibility Studies in Society, Volume 1, Issue 3. This is from last year, but it's, I don't think we've seen this before, so I wanted to go over it a little bit. So this is, an editorial here, Enacting Chance in the Space of Possibility. So this is about the intersection of probability theory and enaction and some other topics. One of these papers, this one here, is called Surprise: Why Enactivism and Predictive Processing Are Parting Ways, The Case for Improvisation, by Sean Gallagher. This is an interesting article because, we've talked about predictive processing and sort of that whole milieu. It's kind of hard to, get a sense of what these things actually mean. But, articles like this kind of bring them together, give us sort of a view of that scientific space. So this paper, it talks a little bit about enactivism and predictive processing and why they're sort of incompatible in an area like improvisation. So, well, let's read the abstract. So by improvisation, they mean something like jazz or dance improvisation, where there's a skill-informed selective uncertainty. That is, you need to know a lot about your craft, about different traditions within your genre, and have skilled know-how, but you don't know where you're going or what you're going to do, where the music or movement will take you. So, we know that like in improvisation, you just have this, skill, kind of, that you're going to do it, but you don't know how the structure of the thing, your performance. So you just use the music or the movement and you build upon that. So the abstract says, can we explain how the various factors of knowledge, skill, habit, environmental constraints, and affordances interact or integrate in improvisational performance? So these are different aspects, things that sort of get integrated in an improvisational performance. In attempting to explain how this integration takes place, I'll consider two possible approaches. The first is predictive processing, which is, of course, a very common model in decision making, actually it's used a lot in active inference, and Enactivism, which of course is, we know what Enactivism is for if you've been in our cognition futures group. I'll argue that predictive processing, which on a neuroscientific view conceives of the mind as set up to avoid surprise. So we talked about Surprisal last week and what that is. It's basically where, you want to avoid being surprised by, say, like a predator, or being surprised by something you don't know anything about. That's why you learn, because you want to learn to avoid these surprisal events, and you can predict the next move that you need to make. And it's very structured, so it's very much against, I guess, maybe improvisation, or maybe it's supports improvisation if you looked at it in a different way. But basically, predictive processing conceives of the mind as being, that's the imperative of cognition, is to avoid these surprise events. And so the author here argues that it will not be able to explain improvisation if it remains true to its own principles. I'm not sure what that means, but basically, if you're trying to avoid surprise, and improvisation is about like these surprising things, or we're responding to surprisal in a different way than predictive processing smooths it out, then I guess that's true. In contrast, they'll argue enactivism as a form of embodied cognition that takes the explanatory unit to be the brain-body environment. So in other words, enactivism is basically a form of embodied cognition that deals with interactions between the brain and body and the environment surrounding that, can offer a better explanation for improvisation. I'll also argue that the notion of habit is central to this account. So this kind of goes through some of this. It talks about, in an improvisation, one aims for surprise, self-surprise. So improvisation is all about surprising yourself with what you generate. And this is, a technique that allows you to achieve novelty, such as the breaking of habits or the avoidance of unusual affordances, or the avoidance of usual affordances. So this is where we avoid affordances and break habits. And that's the sort of novelty you get with improvisation. And these events are surprising because you usually adhere to habits and you use affordances all the time, and that's sort of normal baseline for cognition. But also part of what allows the possibility of surprise is chance, the source of which may be the environment or other performers. So this kind of goes through predictive processing. It goes back to Helmholtz, thinking about perception as an inferential process. It models this process in terms of prediction error minimization, which begins with the assumption that the brain has no access to the external world. So this is where you're just predicting things in the brain. So when you get an input, you're responding to that input by minimizing the surprise of the input. By means of perceptual inference, neuronal processes represent that world by forming probabilistic hypotheses about the world based on an internal Bayesian, which is, of course, statistical, but, the brain, we could argue that it's not really operating on the statistics we use, but it basically replicates a Bayesian model. Hierarchical generative model that it constructs informed by prior knowledge or priors. So you have this prior information that it acts as a Bayesian prior, and it compares the prior knowledge with the incoming knowledge, and it tries to smooth that out and reconcile. The prediction structure can be quite complex, involving a nested cascade of precision-weighted predictive processes in the brain. If the predictions don't match the sensory input, the brain revises its model and corrects its inferences in order to minimize prediction errors, or the conflicts between sensory input and the internal model, which is the previously held knowledge, the sensory input being the newly observed knowledge. So this kind of talks about predictive processing and its goal of reducing surprisal. Surprisal is a subpersonal version of surprise. So I guess this is where surprise is identified by this Bayesian process. The idea that an organism or brain has no direct access to the world is usually explained in terms of a mathematical formalism called a Markov blanket, which defines the boundary of the cognitive system. So that's the idea, is that the boundary is within the brain. You don't have access to the environment. The Markov blanket or the statistical model only incorporates what you encounter as sensory information versus what's already there, and you don't have that environment to, you can't extend the Markov blanket to include the body and parts of the environment. And so, maybe, this is a debate within the field. Maybe you can do this seamlessly, maybe you can't. So there's this debate within the field as to whether the Markov blanket extends outside the brain. And so, some of this is, so according to Jacob Hough, which is this citation here, there is strict closure. PEM should make us resist conceptions of a mind-world relation. Instead, PEM reveals the mind to be inferentially secluded from the world. It seems to be more neurocentrically skull-bound than the embodied or extended perspectives, and action itself is more an inferential process on sensory input than an active coupling with the environment. So there's a position that predictive processing is sort of the opposite of this sort of embodied or extended view of cognition. So, but something like Andy Clark, of course, endorses a more embodied perspective, but also that the brain is in some sense isolated from the world. So in Enactivism, there is no boundary really. It's kind of like the main unit is the brain-body coupling. We don't think about the brain as being secluded in any sense, other than maybe physically or physiologically. So this is, again, kind of Andy Clark's take on this. So this kind of goes through how predictive processing, whether or not it can explain improvisation. And so, according to Andy Clark, to deal with rapidly and fluently with an uncertain and noisy world, brains like ours have become masters of prediction, surfing the waves noisy and ambiguous sensory stimulation by, in effect, trying to stay just ahead of them. So this is basically, this is about prediction, but there's, of course, this noisy aspect to it, an ambiguous aspect. Predictive processing allows us to keep on top of that. So, it's hard to see where, improvisation fits into this. Michael and Wolf apply this account to the example of coordination required for ending a song during an improvised performance. How do several musicians decide when to end a song without agreeing to it in advance? And basically, I guess, this suggests they have a kind of a model here they suggest that the musician's priors include a set of stock endings that are common across the performance community, these operating as constraints on prediction, and this, together with embodied and gestural cues, can help navigate the end of the performance that limits surprise for the performers so they can coordinate their behavior. So there are different ways you can sort of use predictive processing to model improvisation. But there are other people like Frozen, Ikegami, and Ryan who point out that predictive processing simply cannot explain novelty and improvisation. Novelty and surprise are not coextensive concepts, yet both are important features of improvisation. As such, if predictive processing is to help our understanding of how improvisation functions, we'll need to include an account of novelty. But there are a couple of problems. One is that, according to predictive processing, an organism's main aim is to maintain its organization, i.e. stay alive. We talked about this, that this is an immediate sort of goal or an immediate sort of, imperative. And this means by which an organism realizes the same as through prediction error minimization, which is equivalent to minimizing surprise as much as possible. Number two, novelty is something that by definition increases surprise, moving outside the standard statistical regularities faced by an organism and its resulting Bayesian model. So these statistical regularities, can a Bayesian model deal with surprise events or non-normal events? So, this is a fundamental question. You can argue that, okay, we can deal with, improvisation using predictive processing, but you have to kind of jump through these hoops to try to explain how this is done, that there are all these possible endings to a story, and you just pick one, and they're all equally likely, and this sort of thing. So this is one of the problems. It's really reconciling that Bayesian model of smoothing with these surprise events, with these non-uniform events that will characterize surprise. Accordingly, an organism will do its best to stay away from novelty as much as possible. Those are basically the 3 points and how predictive processing is incompatible with explaining improvisation. So this is where they kind of get into this idea that predictive processing and enactivism are incompatible, and that it's leading to the sort of split in the community. And so, this kind of talks about, this debate more. And then finally, Andy Clark argues that it could go either way. Environment and cultural practices may provide limits or may enable creativity. So remember, Andy Clark is the one who argues that predictive processing can extend outside the brain to the body, to the environment. And so even there, where you're kind of reconciling embodiment with predictive processing, you really don't get a clear answer. The question remains, how does it work when it enables creativity? And then, almost as if on cue, these powerful effects are further explored in the work by enactivists sympathetic to predictive processing. For example, these references, which are Reinberg 2018, Reitveld and Kiverstein 2014, Gallagher 2013, the author of this paper, and then Clark 2018. I think this is Surfing Uncertainty or something like that. I don't know if it's the book or a related paper, but that seems exactly right. The focus on embodiment, affect, and environmental coupling actually pushes us away from PP towards more inactive accounts. And so then this goes through enactivism and dynamical processes, getting to predictive processing and or enaction, kind of considering kind of more about this reconciliation or how they're incompatible. And then talking about improvisation as the summary here. And this is sort of a related paper. This is Anderson and Kiverstein. This is actually a new paper from Topics in Cognitive Science. This also talks about predictive processing, but from the roots of rational constructivism. So this is play and cognitive development from rational constructivism to predictive processing. And I'll just simply read the abstract of this paper, but leave it up to you to go read it. So this is from Topics in Cognitive Science. This is a brand new paper, I think from this current issue. So this is kind of building on this idea that, there's a connection between predictive processing and enactivism, but also rational constructivism as a way to sort of, think about how predictive processing fits into some of these different types of creative or, extended approaches. So the abstract reads, it is widely believed that play and curiosity are key ingredients as children develop models of their world. There is also an emerging consensus that children are Bayesian learners. Again, we have this Bayesian model that's, in children you have Bayesian learning, who combine their structured prior beliefs with estimations of the likelihood of new evidence to infer the most probable model of the world. An influential school of thought within developmental psychology, rational constructivism, combines these two ideas to propose that children learn intuitive theories of how the world works, in part by engaging in play activities that allow for the gathering of new information for testing their theories. So we're talking about Bayesian learning, which is using structured prior beliefs, combining the estimations of the likelihood of new evidence. And this is how, they model child learning. There are still, however, at least two pieces missing from rational constructivist theories of development. First, rational constructivism has so far devoted little attention to explaining why children's preferred form of learning, play, feels so fun, enjoyable, and rewarding. And Bayesian approaches are definitely not that. I'm just kidding. Rational constructivism may suggest that children are curious and like to play because reducing uncertainty and learning better theories of the causal workings of the world is enjoyable. Which, if you're a scientist, sure. What remains unclear, however, is why reducing uncertainty in play is interesting, fun, and joyful. So this is, again, we're reducing surprisal, reducing uncertainty in play. Why is this fun and joyful? So in other words, what children are doing is they're learning to reduce their surprise through this Bayesian process, but play has this feeling of being enjoyable and fun and rewarding. But all you're doing, of course, with rational constructivism, is reducing the amount of surprisal in this Bayesian model through play. So that's the paradox. Second, rational constructivism may have overlooked how children during play will take control and manipulate their environment, sometimes in an effort to create ideal niches for surprise extraction. So this is where you're actually, again, like with improvisation, there's this imperative in play to extract surprise from the environment, to manipulate the environment. Those are not compatible necessarily with the Bayesian model. Sometimes this is for developing strategies for making the world fit with their predictions. So, to play, you play with the world, basically. You try to figure out how things fit together in the world, and in doing so, you have to do all these sort of improvisational techniques, all these anti-surprisal minimization techniques. These missing elements from rational constructivism can be provided by understanding the contribution of play to development in terms of predictive processing, an influential framework in cognitive science that models many of the brain's cognitive functions as processes of model-based probabilistic prediction. So I think what they're saying is that rational constructivism uses this kind of Bayesian model, surprisal minimization, but then the solution to that is to apply predictive processing. And in the first paper, of course, they said that for this very thing, predictive processing was incompatible with something like enactivism. So that's that set of papers, those two papers, that special issue. I think that raises a number of interesting questions in like cognitive science and predictive processing and in development.
No, yeah, I'm looking forward to the links. I always feel you should give out the links like 2 days before so we can have a chance. But super interested in the second, just because because of my background in cognitive development. and it's I forget now the experiment that they did with non-human primates, but whether they have a mother that has a like terry cloth like outer layer, so they basically make this mother out of wire mesh.
Yeah.
And so then they have the mother with basically like wrapped in a towel or just left as the mesh, and again the so to this point of like, why is play enjoyable?
Right.
Why is the soft and why is the soft needed? It's not, certainly the authors don't actually explain that. They just
Jesse, you wanted to say something?
I mean, there's a lot of things that I could say. I'm sort of mentally fatigued from other stuff, and my mind isn't really, I don't feel very sharp. So like, there's actually a lot of if you account for that, there's a whole bunch I'd want to say. Like I think this is a really nice, like, I really think this is a very appealing flow of conversation, from complexity to learning to surprise. So like applause for that. Like I really enjoy that. I'll go back and watch this and think of a lot of things from complexity to the bit about all the goal driven stuff. Like I have earlier comments about goal driven stuff, and I don't think I'm saying anything that interesting, but one of the things that just was really pressing on my mind during the whole conversation is like, I know for us, I think it's kind of almost taken as in this, the people right now and having a discussion. I think we're pretty, there's a very self-aware humility, or epistemological humility, if you will, or even a practicing of unknowing, which is from a very different field of study. But like, what I wrote in there, what like the first comment was sort of like, I think I always find it kind of funny when certain conversations about even computation, which is weird for me to say, but like goals and solutions and inputs and outputs, it also feels very much like not. I don't know if it's really this. If I'm saying the same thing as basically like Antarana, 1970 biology of cognition. All of these supposings of goals are just by a third person, and they don't have anything to do with the actual person experiencing it. Like, I guess it's similar to that, but also just sort of the framing of what is a goal. Like, oh, the goal of the cell is solving the problem of solving the problem of XYZ. It's like they have their use, and they also just like, it's a convenient way to think about it for an entity that sees things of the frame and scope and timing and like the metrics, like the means we have. But I think I appreciate that there's also sort of a humility of what those limitations are. So that's sort of that whole thing. But going, and this is a kind of out of context now, so I'll just leave it at that. But going on to the other one and the improvisation and play, I think there's a lot of really interesting things there that we've talked about. I took out the quote, "The avoidance of usual affordances," and that fits really well with the play and boring stuff too. And I think on one level, like I think there's a very like, oh, what drives evolution of life? I think to some extent it's yeah, there's just an aspiration of avoiding certain things and doing other things because it's available. I think it's like because it's there to do is sort of sometimes the reason. And I don't it's both, you can make it sacred or you can make it profane or you can make it nothing. Like that's, but I do think like going specifically to human beings and play, like what is play interesting to the human beings as we understand them, and even to an extent the whole you could dovetail very strongly, or you could have a segmented conversation about, and what's it like for like neurodivergent minds or developing minds, or a mind at this stage of development, or a mind that has this particular take on things that are rewarding and enjoying. And I think reward is sort of a weird term to use here, but what is playful or exciting to certain people, and that's certainly not a uniform thing. But still, like the base mechanisms of different affordances, novelty, different ways of applying things, and different sort of, the diversity of the experiences around those things is interesting. While at the same time understanding that, like, there is sort of a, there's a definite wanting to avoid certain things, whatever that comes up too. Something happened, even in this is a very almost trivial example, but something happened this weekend, like a sports thing happened that had a very specific outcome. That was like, I immediately had to just disassociate from, I can't deal with this. I don't even want to hear discussion about it because it's just so like not rewarding for me at the level of engagement that I have.
Yeah.
But I think that's also like a very particular driver of, that came up too. You're going to say something? Sorry.
No, I wasn't going to say anything.
Oh, I thought something. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I have a lot of really fun sequence of going through all of like the last, I don't know if it was like 40 minutes now or so, but just it was a very fun sequence, and it was nice because it reminded me of things that I haven't focused on for a bit. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's all improvisation. That's all it is.
Yeah. That's why the readings aren't out 2 days ahead of time.
Pretty much.
So.
Definitely thinking about just thinking about my own kids and like how much of that play is playing roles, and just like feeling like you're doing this thing that you're supposed to be doing, it's like having a purpose.
I think that's one of the things. This kind of goes back to what I was saying too. Like I think from a human level and how I think there's a sort of like the bit about, I think one of the papers started with, the alien comes from the 1960s and 40s and they see whatever. I think a true like alien, or even more so like completely in sort of the Michael Levin, let's think about things from really different, you could say sci-fi-ish, but like just different conceptualization of what it means to be an entity or a living machine or whatever and stuff like that. Like I think there's something very important to keeping in mind that from an entity that is very different, let's say, one of the things that would, I suspect, become, and maybe will become present, more evident to like quote unquote us, like the human beings in the future, is the how much, basically it's based, I'm trying to bridge from what Morgan just said, but how much there's this, the role playing, the purpose, the social impact on our interpretation of a lot of things. And not saying that it is or isn't valid, but more like there are lenses that don't have that I think human beings are often biased away from, if that makes sense. And who could say, like, this is totally theoretical, but I feel like there's sort of, in terms of like a lot of the stuff I said in the past, I don't know, month about like vantage points, I think there's vantage points to be had that have useful like lines of sight or vision, but also like very important vantage points that can exist that are not as beholden to that and don't deeply shape some of the conceptualizations of in that way. And I'm not even saying like it's tricky because I'm not even saying I'm not. I feel like so much of this language that I'm using gets turned into, well, yeah, of course, like Richard Sutton, we have that's the bitter problem. Like don't program in anything. And it's like, yeah. Okay, computation, sure. And like, let's figure out the code and let's build the thing and find its own way. Yes. But even more so than that, I think there's sort of a layer of, you're not quite getting far enough away.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it at that. A lot of fun, provoking stuff, though.
Yeah. Why don't we call it a day? And I'll send the papers out. I know it's like hard to, but I sometimes I kind of don't know what I'm going to do. Yeah. So, yeah. All right. So, all right. See you next week. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.